So, welcome everybody to our second lecture of our online lecture series, International Perspectives on the Study of Racism, Definitions, Concepts, Measures with Dr. Carolin Rapp. My name is Cihan Sinanoglu. I am the head of the Office of the National Monitoring of Discrimination and Racism at the DeZIM-Institut. We are extremely honored and pleased to have Carolin Rapp with us today. Before I hand over to Dr. Susanne Veit, who will introduce Carolin Rapp and moderate the discussion with me, I want to say a couple of words about the aim and the content of the lecture series. The term and the concept of racism has only recently been fully acknowledged in German society. While talk of racism has been common in radical movements for the past 2 decades, it was largely avoided in academia and mainstream politics. A series of violent, racist and anti-Semitic attacks in the cities of Halle and Hanau, and ultimately the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in Germany after the killing of George Floyd in the US, brought a radical shift. In the light of these events and under the pressure of the civil society, the federal government has asked the DeZIM-Institut, among others, to shed light on the scale of racism in Germany from a scientific point of view. Our task, however, presents a dilemma. As much as our societies and moreover the communities who suffer from racism urgently need scientific evidence, the positivistic notion that one could measure racism seems to be contested. Against this background, we want to discuss with internationally renowned scholars some of the complications and complexities of the study of racism. Therefore, the lecture series is intended to invite international scientists to comprehend racism in a complex manner in its individual, institutional, structural, and social dimension in order to shed light on racism from a global perspective and the particular challenge for Germany. This talk today will be moderated by Dr. Susanne Veit and me. So I will introduce Susanne here. Dr. Susanne Veit is a social psychologist and has been working at the DeZIM-Institut since January 2020. She is the co-leader of the cluster Data Methods Monitoring, and she is building up the DeZIM lab as an expert of experimental research. After studying psychology in Jena, Madrid, and Potsdam, she first worked as a research assistant at the FU Berlin for 1 year before moving to the Social Science Research Center Berlin in the department Migration, Integration, Transnationalization. She completed her PhD on the consequences of migration-related diversity for social cohesion at the FU Berlin in 2014. In her empirical research, she combined social, psychological and social scientific issues and draws on various predominantly quantitative methods, especially experiments. So I hand over to you, Susanne.
Hello from my side also. I'm very happy and pleased to welcome and introduce Carolin Rapp. Carolin Rapp is a political scientist. She received her bachelor and her master in political and administrative science from University of Constance and her PhD in political science from the University in Bern. After some postdoc years in Bern, she started as an assistant professor in political science in Denmark, first at University of Southern Denmark and since 2018 at the University of Copenhagen. In her main field of interest is the question of social and political tolerance towards immigrants and minorities. Her research has a strong interdisciplinary focus and lies at the intersection between political science, sociology, psychology, and public health. Her most recent research addresses structural and individual discrimination against mobile EU citizens, exploring which mechanism can reduce discriminatory behavior. Today, she will talk about the dimensions of racism or racial prejudice. Her presentation is partly based on an empirical paper in which she draws on the European Social Survey, meaning that her analyses are based on a very large data set with about 37,000 observations from 20 European countries. And you, the audience, are invited to post questions or comments at any time, either in the YouTube chat or by email. You will see the address on the screen now, or you will see it in the chat. We will then pick up some of your questions after the presentation, but might not manage to address all questions. So, dear Carolin, we are looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanna, and also thank you to the DeZIM and Jihan for having me here. I look forward to give you the presentation today about the different perspectives or measurements or operationalizations of racism. I have the first challenge to share my screen. I hope it's working. So, as Susanna said, like the presentation is based on a paper that has a little bit of a history. So I wrote it in 2017 and received the ESS Joel Kasab Prize for that. And then somehow it never got published. So it had a long road, a bumpy road in between. And then I just put it in a drawer and thought, I will look at this at another time. So a lot of things happened in between. A lot of other papers were published, and I more or less forgot about this paper until I was reminded of this one, especially in the time we are in right now. It seems to be of relevance. So I'm quite happy to present this today to you. I have an agenda. There are three main parts I want to go through. So the first part is about the question of conceptualization of racism or racial prejudice, looking at the idea that racism is not a monolithic concept, but is actually more multidimensional. So it goes from one end to another end. So there are different extremes to it, maybe, or it goes from less extreme to more extreme. As the idea of the speaker series is also thinking about how to measure racism. So how can we capture the idea of racism or the degree of racism and racial prejudice within society? I will also briefly talk about how can we capture this empirically. So how do we measure this? I know that there are sometimes or other researchers saying we cannot measure it. I will also present you here a more empirically and quantitative perspective. But I'm also happy to discuss other perspectives afterwards. And as a last point, a very brief point, I also want to reflect a little bit on where are we right now? Like, what are the ways forward in this quantitative racism research? Here, mainly 3 points. Thinking about what do we do if we know what the degree of racism is within society, and how far do we know that attitudes actually transform to behavior? What would my recommendations be if I had the money to measure something right now? What would I do? And also, like, which issues can come along the way? So the first two parts are mainly based on the paper. The last part is more reflection, as well as maybe some points for discussion for later. So where do we start? So there was in the 1960s, 70s, there was a discussion in the US saying racism is dead. As you know, in the recent years, it became quite obvious it is definitely not dead. So this is also the reason why we are here right now. There was a lot of political discussion about racism and racial prejudice, and then also especially the discussion, how can we translate this to the European context? The European context is indeed different from the American context. What I'm going to present you today, or to begin with, like, what is my perspective on this, or what kind of perspective am I showing you today? So there are different forms of racism. There's structural racism, there's individual racism. I will mainly talk about individual, or some say person and interpersonal racism. So it's more about this individual perspective. So what fosters these attitudes and behaviors, for example? So it's not about whether there's institutionalized racism or structural racism in that kind of sense. So we focus today a bit more on the individual perspective. As I already mentioned before, the other perspective I'm having is a bit more of a positivistic perspective. So it's more concerned about how can we measure things? How can we conceptualize this concept in a way that we can also transfer it to measurement, so we can have more information about what is the current state of racism and racial prejudice, for example, in Germany. In the case I'm presenting today, it's in 20 different countries. So this is where I start telling you this is what you can expect from this talk today. So a more individual personal perspective from the analytical side. So starting with the idea, the concept of racism. I found this citation, I think it was from a dissertation, that said not all racial prejudice is created equal. So when you read about racism, racial prejudice in the media, there's a clear perspective. It is one form of racism. But when we look at it from a more conceptual or empirical side, we often see two different sides of it. So on the one side, we have the upfront racist, maybe. On the other side, it is often referred to colorblind racism. Sometimes they are referred to as blatant or subtle racism, or covered and uncovered racism. Where does this come from? So all the research we are looking at and all the literature we draw on is mainly based within the US literature. So the origins here were in the early 1930s to 1950s, 60s, where there was a lot of discussion about very blatant upfront racism, where the discussion was more about biological racism. So this idea that differences between groups, racial groups, are innate. So you can never overcome these differences. So the empirical research in this area about racism in the first half, like until 1950, 1960, was mainly concerned about measuring in how far do individuals believe that there is a biological difference between races. This research came more or less to an end when researchers declared racism is dead. So it's declining. There's no longer racism present in the US, until other researchers came up saying, maybe there's still racism, but it's not biological racism. Maybe it's a softer form. So it's not the person you see here on the left, but it's maybe something that is not that obvious and not that easily measurable. So something you cannot capture by asking individuals, do you believe that some ethnic groups or races are born more hardworking than others, for example? This is a typical question asked for biological racism. So this put researchers towards a challenge, saying like, okay, how, first of all, the old racism is maybe dead, but there might be a new form. So often these are also referred to as old and new forms of racism. So how do we, first of all, conceptualize this? And how can we actually measure this? How can we measure this idea, what you can see here? If I can't see your color, then I cannot judge you. So it is closing the eyes of for differences. So this is the situation where the US research was in probably around the 1970s, 1980s. And this is also where it has been for quite a long time from the empirical side. So from the side of the question of how to measure racism, going more into the direction of this subtle racism, this more colorblind racism, trying to measure this. So this gives you already an idea that there might be different forms of racism and it might differ in their degree. But maybe a more important question is, why should we care about this? So why is the distinction of different forms of racism and racial prejudice important? So it first of all could be that different forms have different origins. When you think about this idea of biological racism, it was often discussed that it's more originates more in personality, in socialization, and other things, whereas the more subtle forms might originate in specific occurrences within the context and might be very context dependent. At the same time, when you think about, going back to these two, when you think about the consequences, like who would, normatively speaking, who would you fear more? So there might be different consequences. So different forms of racism may translate in different forms of behavior or action in that kind of sense. So it's important to capture these different forms. And of course, the better we conceptualize our concepts, so the more we know about our concepts, the better we can get in measuring them and actually painting a picture of the situation in different countries. More precise measures in the end may also help in informing policymakers better, or in creating policies that can have an influence on the different forms. So a policy addressing the issue of biological racism might be a different one than addressing a more subtle form of racism, racial prejudice. You might need different information campaigns, different interventions, and so on. So it is quite basic to what we want to do, or like to the bigger picture, to actually know what we're talking about and then translating this into measurement. I now mainly talked about the American context. There is one study, or at least one study I know, from 1993 from Klein, Penning, and Hagendorn, two Dutch researchers that actually analyzed different forms of racism. So this was the first test of this idea that developed in the 1970s in the US to actually transform this to the European context. So they started also with this idea from the US literature saying racism, racial prejudice is not a monolithic concept. Going back to this idea, there's the difference between blatant and subtle racism. Also going longer back to the research, or the more theoretical research by Bloomer, where he said racism differs according to its intensity and manifestation. Manifestation meaning here how deeply rooted it is. So when you think about we distinguish quite often between values and attitudes, and values tend to be more deeply rooted than attitudes. They are more volatile. So the question is, what form of racism actually might represent a value compared to another one actually being an attitude and being more volatile and may be easier to change in a positive as well as in a more negative direction. What they do in the end, they distinct 4 forms of racism or racial prejudice. So I will also use this quite interchangeably during the talk because they are often used in the same way, racism, racial prejudice. When you look up official definitions, you quite often see racism, racial prejudice in the same. So what they have here is, they say there are 4 distinct forms: biological racism, ethnocentrism, symbolic racism, and aversive racism. What is most important is that they say these 4 forms display something like a step, going from the highest version, biological racism, and going down. So getting less intense from number 1 to number 4. I will briefly present all of these forms, like very briefly, hopefully, before I then move to the operationalizations. So biological racism, I already mentioned this, is this idea of an innate supremacy. So this belief that differences between racial or ethnic groups can never be overcome, because we are born with these differences. Typical things in line with biological racism is often saying some races or ethnic groups are born less intelligent, less hardworking, and so on. So this is the form of racism that was analyzed a lot in the US before the 1960s. And it is the most blatant and direct form. It is probably also the most aggressive form. The issue is, when you think about, I already told you something about the measures, is it is hardly ever measured. And the idea is also that the roots of this form of biological racism lies within individual personalities, for example, authoritarianism, and also in socialization processes. And that kind of sense, the literature has also shown that to change this form of racism seems to be more difficult than changing a form that lies below this most blatant form of racism. It is also highly criticized. I write here in the US, but it's also highly criticized in other contexts. And there are a lot of researchers that claim that actually biological racism is dead. We will come back to this one where I can actually show you, maybe it was more or less declared dead because no one asked about this. So showing you the connection between this idea of conceptualization and then also the measurement. Ethnocentrism is, according to Sumner from 1906, so a long time ago, is also this idea that one's own group is the center of everything. So one's group, in-group, your own racial ethnic group is the center of everything within the world. And all others are scaled and rated according to that. It is still a strong focus on the superiority of ethnicity or race, but the idea is, compared to biological racism, the idea is that cultural differences may be overcome, even though there can never be equality between the groups. So one group always wants to be superior to the other group, most of the times the majority group. Symbolic racism was mainly found in the 1970s in the US context. It is still a bit concerned with ethnic or racial supremacy, whereby it is mainly based on cultural differences or similarities instead of, like with biological racism, this idea of innate differences. The main thing is the balance between groups. So individuals feeling the symbolic racism fear that their privileges or that they will have less rights than a minority group. So think about countries where there are special minority legislation. So this might increase ideas of symbolic racism, where this ideas other groups may have more rights. Compared to the other two forms, the idea of equality between groups is supported. So here you can see it is a more subtle form. So there's still some group comparison going on, and there might be some negative, the idea of racism is like negative attitudes, but there's a general idea of equality. The most subtle form, but maybe also the most complicated form in this idea from Klein, Pennick, and Hagedorn is aversive racism. Because these are also the ones that are most difficult to capture if you would like to measure it. Because here it's individuals can have aversive racial prejudice even though they say they don't have it, for example. There is support for racial equality. You regard yourself as non-prejudiced. At the same time, you have unconscious negative feelings. So it is very intrinsic. It is not obvious. So if you ask a person, are you a racist or not? They would probably say no. A lot of people would say no. But these attitudes can be captured, or this idea is that you see this form of aversive racism by avoiding social interactions. So this goes back, or this concept goes back to Dovidio and Gertner, who did an experiment also in the 1970s, as far as I remember, where they tested their idea of aversive racism with an experiment, with a field experiment. The idea was that they randomly dialed numbers, or they found out in the US, you have voter registrations, you know who tends to vote for Democrats, you know who votes for Republicans. And their idea was that Republicans might be more blatant racist, whereas Democrats tend to be more aversive. What they did is they dialed numbers of Democrats or Republicans naming an either black name or a more white name to the person saying, I had an accident, sorry, I've dialed the wrong number, can you help me? What happened that the Republicans straight out said, or most of them said, sorry, I cannot help you, if this was a typical black name. What happened with the Democrats when someone called them with a typical black name, they hung up. So this was how they tried to show that this concept exists, that there is some form of unconscious bias. Because here, this idea was social distance or interaction is avoided, that people or individuals are not forced to act according to their unconscious attitudes. To sum this up, more or less, this is a very complicated table. This is adapted from the Klein-Penning-Hagendorn paper, where you can again see what the ideas behind the 4 different forms of racism. You also have the category of egalitarian or non-racist, where you can see if you want to conceptualize the different dimensions, you can see how does this form perceive differences in culture, what is the idea of superiority, how is threat perceived from outgroups, here ethnic or racial minorities. What about rights? So you can see aversive racism supports equal rights. Symbolic racism is also for equal rights, whereas ethnocentrism does not support this idea. And biological racism, you can see, has, for example, no rights at all. There are different, also these categories about adjustment, segregation, how should groups live together, this idea about this, how much social distance is perceived in that category, and what would an ideal society look like. So this is the more conceptual dimension, showing that there might be some, well, when you look at symbolic racism and ethnocentrism, there might only be nuances between those. Whereas when you look at biological racism and aversive racism, they seem to be quite far apart. So what Klein-Penning and Hagendorn did in their paper, and what I also do in my paper, is actually empirically testing whether or not these forms are actually different. So trying to translate these 4 concepts into measurements, and then testing whether we can actually see or if they are different concepts or not. So going to the second part about measuring the different forms of racism. But before I get there, this might be a very European specific issue, is the question, who are we actually talking about? Now I said all the time, racism, racial prejudice, ethnic minorities or racial minorities. But when we look at existing data, so here I work with existing data, how did existing surveys ask about racism? So this is an example from the Eurobarometer 1997, which was 1997 was declared the year of racism in Europe. This is why this Eurobarometer was focused on measuring racism, where you see here the idea is the people who live in our country come from different races, religions, and cultures. So here you see individuals are asked about someone of different races, religions, and cultures. So there's no clear, it seems like there's no clear-cut distinction in the US. When we look at racism measures, we see that there are questions, how do we feel about blacks, Latinos, and whites? There's a clear categorization. Here, what I'm showing you, it is a bit mixed. So races, religions, and cultures are different things. The other thing is, and how far is it different from immigrants when you think here, who are not citizens of a member state of the European Union? So it could be immigrants that actually have a different ethnic or racial background. An example from the European Social Survey that I'm actually using, here they say, thinking about people who have come to live in your country from another country who are of different race or ethnic group from most country people. So here it's a clear distinction between race and ethnic group. When we look at the definition of the European Commission of racism, they actually say it is not possible to conceptualize racism in the European context because this would mean you have to admit that there are different races, which they don't do. So here they come to the definition: it's a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, national or ethnic origin. So here nationality is also included. So the big question is, when we want to measure attitudes, racial prejudice and racism, and we have questions like this, or how do we ask about different racial groups? Do we, in the European context, and think about the German context, can we actually ask this? Is it possible to measure this? And more importantly, when you read a question like that, who do you actually think of? So it is quite important. Research has shown individuals that think about Muslims instead of a different racial group have different attitudes than someone thinking about a specific racial group. Or most of the times we see, when asked about immigrants or a different ethnic group, a lot of people are thinking about African immigrants or Northern African immigrants, Arabs, and so forth. So the question is, who do people actually think of? There is one paper actually showing this, where it's mainly focused on foreigners, but I'm showing you this here because it gives an idea that there are differences in the perception of these groups when we ask people about it. So it's by Asbrook and colleagues, called "Who Are These Foreigners Anyway?" And they simply ask, who do you think of in the German context when you hear the term foreigner, Ausländer? So think about, we would do the same, asking individuals, who do you think of when you hear other ethnic or racial groups? In Germany, most respondents thought about the biggest, that kind of an immigrant group, Turks. A lot of people also thought about Eastern Europeans, others thought about Muslims being completely different. So if you ask in a survey about foreigners, and individuals start thinking about Muslims, this is something completely different than actually asking a question about foreigners. Here also, Southern Europeans and Vietnamese. We also see differences between East and West Germany. So these are percentages. So this is just a little warning. So what I'm going to show you now is based on questions that already exist, based on questions where we do not know who respondents are actually thinking about. So this is the downside on relying on existing data instead of having the possibility to do or develop your own measure. Here's the example of now going from the concepts we had before, the 4 concepts, to actually measuring it. I have here the comparison how Klein, Pennock, and Hagendorn did it in 1993. And these are similar items from the European Social Survey 2014. Something about the Klein, Pennock, and Hagendorn study, they only used students, not students, pupils. So they had a convenience sample. It was the first study ever looking at different forms of racism. I'm showing you here in the following only the measures for the most extreme forms, the most blatant and the most subtle form. So I'm also happy if someone is interested in a paper, I can certainly distribute this. So here you see the idea is the definition or the conceptualization of biological racism was this idea of that groups or differences between groups are innate. There are questions, that was a huge discussion in the ESS, especially in some countries, because there were countries who said, we cannot ask these questions. So on this side, do you think some races or ethnic groups are born less intelligent than others? And do you think some races or ethnic groups are born harder working than others? These are the most typical questions that also have been used in the US context and that are hardly used anymore because of this idea, we cannot ask these questions. The ESS did it. They asked the questions, and I'm showing you here when we combine them on a scale having lower values, meaning being lower on the biological racism scale, higher values being higher. I marked here some of the countries where we can see different distributions. So you see a lot of countries, for example, when we look at Austria, these are percentages on the left side, where you see a lot of people score more on the low side of biological racism, actually saying no to these questions. So both answer categories were yes or no. Whereas in other countries, there's almost seemingly, like in the Czech Republic, a polarization. Many people scoring low on it, a lot of people also scoring high on it. The same in Estonia. In Great Britain, it's slightly different, and Portugal is, that's why I marked it, one of the countries that has a very equal distribution, but also a little peak on the right. So what does this show us? Like, not asking the question does not mean that there is maybe, or that there maybe is no biological racism. It shows like we asked the question in 20 different countries, and we see a distribution and a variance over the 20 countries. So there are differences between the countries, and maybe this form of racism is not dead, even not in the European context. Going briefly to this more subtle form of aversive racism, which is mainly concerned about this idea of social distance. So these measures are also often called in social psychology social distance measures, where this idea is that you do not want to have a person from here, a different race or ethnic group, close to you, like being appointed as your boss or marrying a close relative. In the Klein-Pennig-Hagendorn, it was the idea of having classmates because it were pupils, and don't not want to have someone of this group as neighbor. So this idea of having actually no negative attitudes, but trying to keep a distance because there might be a threat from this group. How does this look like? This scale in the European context. Here in Austria, it's very equally or almost normally distributed. Again, lower values meaning low on the aversive racism scale, higher values meaning that you are high on this scale. There are some countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, Spain, also Switzerland and Germany, as well as Denmark, being quite high on the there is no aversive racism scale, whereas other countries like Lithuania or Hungary being more equally distributed. Also showing again that we can find this form in the European context, and then there is a diversity and there's a variation of this form between countries and probably also within countries. What did I then do in this paper? So I'm sparing you all the details, like the empirical details, but what I tried to do is actually empirically test with a confirmatory factor analysis whether these 4 different forms of racism, racial prejudice, actually exist throughout the 20 countries. Here you can see the abbreviation of the measures for ethnocentrism, saying that other racial groups should commit to the way of life within the country, and they should have the same tradition. So this kind of idea of assimilation that is important in ethnocentrism. And the symbolic racism, this fear of others or outgroups having more rights. This questions about immigrants. Here it's unfortunately immigrants, so but we don't know who's talking about. These are the who we are thinking about. Being better treated. Of course, a downside, these are probably not the best measures, but this is something where we can come as close as possible to the concepts with existing data. So what do I find is exactly what I'm showing you here. I find that there are 4 different concepts of racism, and I can empirically show this that that we can distinguish these 4 forms. What I'm also showing there is this idea that Klein-Pennig and Hagendorn had of the scalability. So what does this mean? As I said before, this idea is that biological racism is the most blatant form and aversive racism is the least blatant or the most subtle form, and that it goes up like stairs. So the idea is if you say yes to, for example, those two biological racism questions, you should also say or have high values on the ethnocentrism scale, on the symbolic racism scale, and on the aversive racism scale. On the other hand, if you're high on aversive or only on aversive racism, you should have low values on all the other three. So this idea of a stepwise progression. How did I test this? In a very simple way here, in the paper it's more detailed, is transforming all of these four scales to high and low values based on the mean. So if you were above the mean, you receive a 1. If you're below the mean, a 0. I also tested this with other possibilities, high, below and above the median, and so forth. This idea is simply testing this idea of the stepwise progression of the scales, where you see that they're egalitarians. They should have a 0 on aversive racism, symbolic racism, ethnocentrism, and biological racism. So making sense, like if you're low on all of them, you're the most egalitarian. And this applies in the data set over the 20 countries for 28% of the respondents. The other idea is if you're high on aversive racism and also low on the combination of being low on all the others, then symbolic racism, high on aversive racism and symbolic racism. When you're high on ethnocentrism, and then you should have the symbolic and aversive racism and biological racism. This idea, if you say yes to these questions, if you're high on this scale, you're probably also high on all the other scales. And this applies to 16% of all respondents. So 16% of all respondents that are high on biological racism are also high on all other three forms of racism or racial prejudice. Certainly, this is not, the scalability only applies to 60% of all. There are different combinations for 40% of the others in the sample. So it might be questionable if there is a true scalability, especially when you look at these middle categories on the scale. There might be a problem with the distinction, or individuals may think of something else when they hear the question. So there needs to be more research going in that direction. But in general, as a principal finding of the paper, it shows that we can distinguish conceptually the four forms of racism, and we can test this empirically throughout 20 different countries. Moreover, there is a tendency that we can also scale these four forms in this direction, having this stepwise progression. So for the last very few minutes, the question, like, what can we learn from this, what I presented you right now? So this idea of different forms of racism and also capturing it, maybe not capturing it in the best way, but capturing in a way that is available right now. This general idea, what do we do with all this research on racism? We want to measure it and it's more descriptive. What can we learn from this when actually attitudes do not translate into actions? So one of my favorite papers is from Lapia from 1934, where he actually shows going with, or the idea is he's asking or sending a questionnaire to different restaurants and hotels in his surrounding, asking whether they would serve a Chinese couple or if it would be okay for them to stay in the hotel. About 99% said no when he sent out these questionnaires, saying no, we would not serve them, they would not be allowed to stay here. So this is something we do when we do surveys. We ask people, what would you do? What are your attitudes? He then, at that time point, took a Chinese couple, let them go alone, sometimes with him, to restaurants, to exact the same restaurants he asked before, and also to the hotels. What happened? Only 2 of these hotels and restaurants he went to said no to not serving them or to not letting them stay there. So what he's showing is this discrepancy between attitudes and action. What someone might answer on a questionnaire may not translate into what they actually want to do. So here we have to think about, what do we do when we start measuring racism? What do we want to explain? So do we also want to know something about how does it translate into action? And in this kind of sense, does it translate into differential treatment? Differential treatment meaning here discrimination, here discrimination based on someone's ethnic or racial background. So do we know that, or why is it important to know that? Because monitoring racism is one thing, but on the other hand, we also have to monitor what is happening, what is the outcome of this. So are there different outcomes if you're more on the biological racism side or on the more aversive side? So these are just examples from the US, and also I think it's a Dutch example, or Belgian it could also be, where the question really is, do we find these blatant translations of attitudes into action, where we can see maybe some kind of structural discrimination, institutional discrimination, but also in this kind of sense, what I'm presenting here today, this individual discrimination based on this. So the general question also, how do attitudes and actions relate to each other? So recently I'm doing more research, that's why I'm talking about it, on this differential treatment, and also questions when we look at differential treatment, what kind of mechanisms can actually reduce this? So research has shown that the best way to reduce it is perspective taking. So this idea of taking the perspective of the person you've been judging maybe before, you've been asked about before. So there's a lot to do in that kind of sense. So how to measure racism in the European context, like the big question. What I would do, I would always ask first, who do people actually think of? You can get diverse results depending on how you ask the questions. You saw, I gave you the examples. Do you ask about different nationalities? Do you ask about racial, ethnic background? Do you ask about cultural background? Do you ask about religious background? So it depends. If we want to capture racism and racial prejudice in the European context, we have to think about who will they think about, the persons you're asking. So only if we first capture this, we can make more inference about the results. Then my recommendation, of course, is looking at the different degrees of racism. There are different scales. There's a modern racism scale, an old racism scale, and so forth. So actually trying to capture these different forms, these different degrees, because they can have different origins and consequences. The issue is how to capture the more implicit forms of racism, so the more aversive form. This probably most likely can be done with survey experiments, implicit association tests, but recently there have been some publications actually showing that implicit associations tests do not capture implicit attitudes, only explicit attitudes. So in this direction, we need to do more. And we need to know more about this distinction between attitudes and actions. So this question about also a general causality issue. We do not want to explain attitudes with attitudes, but we actually want to know how attitudes translate into actions, and how can we have an influence how they translate from attitudes to actions. This is also then the focus on more policy implications, this idea of reducing racism and reducing preferential treatment, in that kind of sense, discrimination. So on a last note, maybe also some critical reflections on this research area. There is a huge discussion going on. So while I am in Copenhagen, in Denmark, the last 2 weeks were marked by the fact that researchers were accused of not being neutral enough, especially in the area of gender, race, and immigration research. this came up with a general discussion about how neutral is this research. Is there an absence of a political motivation? I would love to say always there is. This is why I'm more looking at measurements. But certainly, why am I doing this kind of research? Because it's my interest of doing this research. I'm more interested in this research than, I don't know, political economy. So this is a general question we have to ask from a researcher side. Then the question of diversity in research. Look at me. I'm not the typical diverse person. So how can we overcome this, or overcome this general critique about having this very wide research, having more integration of people of color if possible, more collaborations, but also maybe going deeper into the discussion with the target groups of racism and racial prejudice. So more dialogue there also when we think about having more empirical tools. And something I was made aware of actually first last week is also always the question, how much, so when we do a lot of research about ethnic minorities, racial minorities, it is of course always keeping it in mind or showing that there are differences between groups. So how can we do research in this area without pointing too much about the differences between groups? Because the aim is to actually dissolve differences at one point maybe. So but what we do at the same time in this research area is pointing the finger at differences between groups. So I think there is a lot of discussion, hopefully, and a lot to discuss. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting to me, and I think for the audience too. So we now start with the discussions. So some of the audience already sent some questions or comments in the chat or via email, and you are invited to go on doing so. And we might now already post the first questions that were sent already. And Gian, if it's okay to you, I would start with the first. Okay. Because I combine kind of three questions. One is my own, one is from the chat, and one was sent by email. So I start with my own because that's the most comprehensive one, I'd say, because you gave really a good description why it is necessary and important to consider different dimensions of racism and how it is used and described in large surveys. But I would be really interested in what is your own point of view. So if you think of the word race, what do you mean by that if you use it in a European context? And the same for racism. So what is racism for you as a concept? What does it mean? What does it include? And then now the first questions from the audience, which are really related, because the first question was from the chat. And somebody asked, how does this framework deal with positive racism, such as positive stereotypes about certain groups? And then there was a question that was sent per email asking, if you are talking about new or soft racism, and if distinction is important, how is using racism to describe these phenomena still a good idea in terms of it evokes slavery, apartheid, and so on?
Perfect, thank you. So to the first question, so what do I mean, or how would I use it? I would actually, personally, I would not use it. So it's more like following the literature. I think, yeah, with the paper, I had discussions with reviewers about, because I changed it from racism to ethnic prejudice, because reviewers said, like, you cannot use the term racism in the European context. So there was a very controversial discussion about that. However, when you follow the literature, it is always the discussion about racism. In the European context, when I would do a survey, I would not use the term race probably, because it is, first of all, controversial. It is, on the other hand, like, who do people really, what I said, like, who do people think of? Like, what is the definition of different races? Like, is it only the difference between black and white? Is it a difference between black, white, and Latinos? Or is it then also different races in that kind of sense? So it is always better probably to give, when you try to measure it, to give a specific groups, be as specific as possible. The same maybe, I mean, now it was more the question about race, but also I had this discussion with colleagues about ethnicity. So we thought about, like, we wanted to do an experiment changing race, so just by changing skin color, but then we thought, how do we integrate ethnicity? But then the question arises, like, what is the difference then between ethnicity and race? Ethnicity being more the cultural version, but how do you test this if you have pictures, when you use pictures of individuals? And we actually discussed that ethnicity is more important, the cultural differences, than actually maybe the racial differences. But it is mixed, because often you test ethnicity differences and ethnicity by also changing the skin color. So there are mixed categories, and it's not that clear cut in the European context when you compare it to the US context. The second question about the positive racism. So here, like, the measures, they are really only about, if you want to say, like, at more negative versions, or like the negative attitudes towards an outgroup in that kind of sense. So when I mainly think about, like, positive racism, I more or less think about positive discrimination. So if there are certain privileges for groups based on their ethnic or racial background. So it doesn't mean the 4 different forms are not, they cannot be combined with the more positive attitudes. Here, what I presented is more like there's one version just looking at the negative attitude side, but certainly you could also go towards the other direction and asking, like, what if we go more to the left, you could say there's the egalitarian where we stop right now, but what does come before that, or what does go more in the positive direction? I think this is also a possibility to rethink these concepts or expand them, actually. And the last question, I only wrote down racism, and now I don't know what it was.
Yeah, the question was if there are more mild forms, for example, with aversive racism, how would the concept of racism still fit, since racism seems to imply also apartheid, slavery, and so on, so stronger phenomena, harder phenomena.
Yeah. So maybe this also goes back then to the first question, is like, how would I use race, or should we use race? So this is maybe more of a normative question, and it also applies to the last point I had on the slide. So in how far are researchers creating categories and groups by researching about specific concepts like racism, like maybe also increasing the awareness, not only in a positive, but also maybe in a negative way when doing research on racism. So depending on what we're looking at, I said it now before, like being more the negative attitudes towards outgroups. This is a more broader category, or you could point it as analyzing, it's more like negative, different degrees of negative attitudes towards outgroups, or different beliefs about outgroups. Outgroups being then defined as different racial, ethnic, religious groups, or maybe also national groups. So in general, so on a very, going from the not being politically motivated or not personally motivated, going away from that, I would also be on that side saying, maybe we know what we're talking about, it's racism, but at the same time, it is not as clear cut as in other countries, and it's so mixed that it's more about negative attitudes in different degrees in that kind of sense.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you, Carolin, for your really interesting talk. So I will follow with a couple of questions. First one is from the chat as well. So what is the role of mass media in how people conceptualize terms like foreigner or immigrant when taking part in a survey, for example?
Yes, I think the media has, of course, a huge influence. I mean, also political parties, of course, have a huge influence in all public discourse that frames different categories. So most of the times when you read something, you have it about immigrants in general, but then more specific with it, maybe within the text. There are new tendencies, what I know it mainly now from the Danish context, where there's a huge focus on non-Western immigrants. So non-Western immigrants are now a new category. In general, I would say the media plays maybe one of the strongest role in actually framing like what maybe racism is, how it is understood, how the media reported about demonstrations of the Black Lives Matter and also other things in that context. So they can actually shape what people are thinking about. So if immigrants or ethnic groups are always associated with non-Western or Arab immigrants, for example, then individuals will also have the tendency to think about this group because it's this typical mental shortcut. So it creates a mental shortcut. If you hear it the whole time, you don't have to think about that often, like who's an immigrant for you, when you know, like, oh yeah, I read about it. It's more non-Western immigrants, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to just combine two questions. The first one goes in the direction of Susanna, and the second one is more than that. So what is the definition or understanding of racism when we try to understand racist conditions with research on individual attitudes and prejudices? And linked to that question is, how can the research of attitudes and prejudices be combined with other methodological approaches, especially if we understand racism as a structural and institutional phenomenon?
So the definition, when you look at like the official definitions and what's the dictionary, the Merriam something in the US, where the definition of racism is actually, it is prejudice against specific racial or ethnic groups. So there is a strong link between this idea of racism and prejudice. Then looking at this definition, also when I showed you the definition of the European Commission, where there's also, it's a broader definition. At the same time, there's also, you could say a more narrow definition, because they mainly say it is violence against these groups. So there they have the definition of racism, that it's more indicated by individual violence towards specific groups, that this is actually more this action side of it and not the attitudinal side. So in general, I would say there's a lot of overlap between like measuring attitudes or defining attitudes, as well as prejudice and racism. So because when you look at different, for example, the European Social Survey and other surveys, they use the same measures, or when you look at publications, often the same measures are used are used for different concepts. So when you look throughout the literature, the same question, the social distance question, is sometimes used for measuring ethnic exclusionism. Another time it's used for ethnic prejudice. Another time it's used for anti-immigrant attitudes. So this is why I think research has to go maybe to step back and think more about the concepts before we start implementing measures again. And also maybe making a more clear distinction, what we don't have right now, between this idea of attitudes and ethnic racial prejudice on the other side, or maybe defining that they are, or that they go together. Then the second question about how does this individual perspective go together with this idea that racism is more a structural and institutional issue. This is, I come more from this individual research perspective. And of course, the idea is most often, within institutions, the individuals are working within institutions. So when you think about all this research about discrimination by street level bureaucrats, where they rely on individual level theories, and it's the idea of individual level behavior that tries to explain more structural discrimination. So it's this, again, like for the first question, it's more this interaction between a more individual perspective and a structural perspective. So they rely on each other and they influence each other. So the context, the structural dimension is never independent of the individual dimension, as well as the structural dimension, or the individual dimension is not independent of the structural dimension. So we all live in a specific context within a specific country. And when you, as an individual, see it is okay, certain types of discrimination or saying certain things, again, going maybe back to the media question, if the media says something, political parties say something, that will influence how you, how your attitudes, your kind of prejudice is. And at the same time, the structures, institutions do also react to what is going on within the population. So having like a feeling for the climate of attitudes or the climate of prejudice of what is actually going on. So often the media and political parties take up the climate of attitudes that is prevalent within society. So I would say most often in research, as I said it in the beginning, I'm looking at the individual perspective, but both structural and individual perspective, they are not independent from each other. And it's always a chicken egg question, who influences who first?
There's another question from the chat, which relates a bit to your kind of, when you introduced the 4 forms of racial prejudice or racism, you said that we have to understand them as steps towards stronger intensity. And a question from the chat reads, when measuring prejudice, is there a way to describe degrees of devaluation, for instance, to account for benign prejudice in comparison to homicidal levels of prejudice?
I think I need to hear that again.
When measuring prejudice, is there a way to describe degrees of devaluation, for instance, to account for benign, so more positive prejudice in comparison to homicidal, so really negative, strong levels of prejudice?
So this would, again, maybe going back to the question before, expanding these steps. And also these steps are not that clear cut. So conceptually, I presented them as very clear cut, but in the end, they are quite mixed. So it is maybe possible that you have ethnocentric attitudes, but at the same time have also more positive attitudes, like more positive prejudice. This might also then depend again on what kind of groups we're looking at. So is this one thing, the ethnocentrism could be more towards different ethnic and racial groups, whereas the more positive attitudes can be more about immigrant groups or specific immigrant groups that are not distinguished by ethnic or racial lines. So it is, well, conceptually more clear-cut than it probably is in reality. And also, again, thinking about the different groups, because there everything mixes up again, and you can have different attitudes at the same time. So we don't know that much about this right now because it's hardly ever asked. Like within one survey, there are not that many different questions capturing all the positive or all the negative sides of something.
So then the solution would probably be to have more questions of different types towards different targets and concerning different kind of attitudes or evaluations. I guess because that remembers me a lot on the stereotype research, of course, because you can have kind of positive stereotypes about minority groups, which are still kind of damaging and negative because they are still a stereotype that is imposed on a whole group or that on an individual.
Go back again to this idea, how do positive stereotypes or positive prejudice and negative prejudice translate into action?
Yeah.
So is there actually a difference? So conceptually, when you have the difference, do they translate in different kinds of action?
Okay.
I have another question. Racism often occurs in combinations of various, mostly arbitrarily selected characteristics, like Hall puts it, race is a floating signifier. So what is the point of this differentiation here? So does this clear demarcation make sense?
So the sense in that, I would say, if we want to give a picture, or if the question is, or you are asked, what is the situation of racism within Europe? So then it makes sense to first look at what are we talking about? Are individuals asking, or are we asking about, is there biological racism in Europe, or what is, I mean, it's more like we have to define what are we actually looking at? So what do we define also as a researcher, or maybe it could be as policymakers? What is the issue we want to look at? So there might be, when you think back, or what I've showed you, when you think you only look at biological racism, this idea from the US research that saying like maybe it doesn't exist anymore, it's dead, then therewith saying like, there's no issue within society, there's no need to further look into this. It should not be on the political agenda. So I think that it is important to look at these different dimensions because they can occur differently within society. And at some point in time, one version can be more important, maybe, or in some countries, ethnocentrism is maybe more of an issue than aversive racial prejudice. So I think the distinction is, in that kind of sense, makes sense because if we want to look at racism, we have to know that that is not only one version of it, because it might underestimate, or at the same time it might overestimate the degree of racism actually. So being precise about what we want to do and about the different concepts makes it then easier to draw conclusions about the situation within countries. Oh.
That's great. So since we do not have a question right now, or do we? There is one. So, but afterwards, thereafter, I have a question. There's one reading. When surveying, how do you address the problems that participants are likely to conceal prejudicial, how do you say, their attitudes, especially very aggressive levels of prejudice that are not widely accepted socially? So it's a question on the social desirability.
Yeah. So social desirability bias in these kind of surveys are always an issue. So the issue is mainly, there's like, I'm close to a hospital, so it's, I think there's a helicopter. So there might be an underestimation of the actual situation. One way to try to avoid this is, of course, what has been done in the past, probably 5 to 10 years, is more relying on survey experiments, for example, list experiments. I often use in my research conjoined experiments, but to be honest, I think respondents already know when they see certain things even if it's an experiment, what it is about. So we cannot circumvent a social desirability bias by maybe using survey experiments, because individuals are already too informed about it, especially if an issue is very politicized at the moment, when it's highly discussed in the media, and then certainly you receive a lot of questions that go in that direction. Individuals will know what this is about. So social desirability is an issue, and probably it will always be. So it's quite hard to circumvent this. We tried with survey experiments, but my hunch is that it's getting more and more difficult. And also the issue, well, maybe I should mention that the ESS is always face-to-face. So these questions are asked face-to-face. The ESS is only now thinking about changing that, but for example, the biological racism questions were asked with someone sitting in front of you, and we nevertheless see quite high numbers in some countries. So it might be underestimated actually. So this, how we ask it and in what kind of mode we ask it also plays a role. Probably online surveys are a little bit better, but respondents are quite smart sometimes.
So I have another question, but Jan had one too. So maybe because I posed the question, it's now better your turn.
Carolin, you talked at the end of your talk. You talked about, or you said we have to include the civil society communities who are affected by racism. So, do you have any idea or suggestion how to do it? I mean, in terms of participatory or collaboration and so on and so on. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's probably easier. Well, one idea is to include more researchers, like researchers of color, which is a very difficult issue within the European context because there are not that many. And so it's probably an easier task, but it should be the motivation to do this in the future, especially also to support research in this area. But with the inclusion of civil society, what I've been thinking about, or what the idea was with certain projects, was actually making some focus groups and thinking about like what is the main issue. Like if you are on the receiving end, what do you believe is actually the definition maybe of racism? So going maybe from the other direction, like not from putting on these researcher glasses and always saying like, this is the official definition, this is what I presented you, these are the 4 different forms, but actually receiving feedback on the reality. So can you see the differences? There is one, I found one PhD thesis that used an approach like in that direction, simply showing also with survey experiments, showing respondents that were from different racial groups, certain situations where there were situations of discrimination and also an explanation of what kind of, why there was this discrimination. And they should judge whether this was more a subtle form of racism or whether this was more a blatant form of racism. So maybe going in this direction, actually showing questions and then asking maybe not only those suffering or being on the receiving end of racism and prejudice, but also larger groups of how would they judge these kind of questions or these kind of actions? Would this be, in what kind of category would this fall? Would it be more a subtle form or more blatant form? And on that background, establishing or going back then to the measures and rethinking them.
That's a great idea. I have a kind of large question, since like your study is a bit of a cross-national large-scale replication of the original study, right? And you had to use what you could find in the survey, right? And there are of course some weaknesses with how you measure the different kind of forms of racial prejudice. And I think the strongest weakness to me is, for example, in the measurement of the aversive racism, since you measure social distance, which is really a very direct measure, and it's not at all unconscious or subtle. So, but therefore, so if you now would have like money without limits and time and resources and people, stuff, what kind of project would you start to tackle this question? So what would be parts of it or elements?
Yeah, probably going back to this idea of survey experiments. So I used to be a fan of implicit association tests, and now I read a lot about like new studies saying like it's not working. So this was more like the situation, okay, what else can we do? We had very good experience or in a completely different context with list experiments. So really trying to trigger this out. We did it in the context of sexual violence actually after war. So this could be an option to do this. But the more, it also helps, what we also tried is actually using open-ended questions, because by text you can also, I mean, there are new possibilities to actually analyze a large number of text, and where you ask about individuals, what they think, why others, or asking them about their attitudes, and then asking later, how do you think others justify that have the opposite attitude of you? And how would you justify your own attitude? So going in a positive and a negative direction. And when you compare this with text analysis, you can actually maybe trigger out some things, and also the way words are used. We had good experiences. So actually respondents write a lot. So we thought maybe no one will write something, but they did. So this might be a possibility, but probably also not the best. I think this is still the biggest weakness in research, and this is also something I still have to think about, like how to best capture this most aversive version. I still love the experiment by Davidier and Gärtner, so having more these field experiments. So maybe going in that direction.
Yeah, that's great to hear, since I'm very much a fan of experimental research. I would also like to say some good words about the implicit association test, because it has some weaknesses, but also a lot of advantages. And like the list experiment, I'm aware of that, but that's also very conscious, right? It's a good way to prevent social desirability, but it's of course also not a good measure of some subtle and unconscious biases in people's minds. Yeah, right.
Okay, so when there are not more questions, I would stop it here, and I would like to say thank you to Carolin Rapp for this really interesting talk. Thank you for Susanne Veit for moderating the discussion today. We will have our next lecture series on the 12th of July with Sharat Goel, and it will be also on the topic of how to measure racism. So he will have other theoretical and methodological access to this topic. So looking forward to see you again. And again, thank you very much, Carolin Rapp, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you for having me here. Thanks.